You're watching CTS, Family Friendly.
Hi and welcome to Rhonda London Live. On the show today, the blurry line between fiction and fact. A 16-year-old Cornwall area boy spent 30 days in jail for writing a story in which a tormented teen plans to blow up his school. The teenager, who cannot be identified, suffered bullying and teasing in real life, but maintains the story entitled Twisted is just fiction. He says it was simply a class project, a story that his literary hero, Stephen King, might applaud. The police, however, took things very seriously, and the teen has been charged with uttering death threats. What do you think about this? Can imagination be put on trial? And is there any way to predict violent behavior in youth? I want to hear what you have to say, and as always, the phones will be open to take your calls, so don't go away. We're back right after this. Talk about a creative writing assignment ending badly. An 11th grader from a small community north of Cornwall was arrested, strip searched, and he spent more than 30 days in jail after writing a revenge fantasy monologue for his drama class. The 16-year-old, who cannot be identified, suffered at the hands of schoolyard bullies. He was even beaten up during a sports game. He maintains his story, entitled Twisted, is simply fiction, something that his hero, Stephen King, might write. The police are not so sure. And with his thoughts on all of this, we're joined by Steward Auty. He's the founding president of the Canadian Safe School Network. Stewart, thank you so much for joining us.
Pleasure, Rhonda.
Your thoughts on this case? Do you think the police overreacted?
I don't know. I know that it sounds like a pretty complex affair. Because of the Young Offenders Act, we don't have all the information about this, about all the details of the incident. But there's no doubt that when you have a threat like that, whether it's supposedly fiction in a classroom, that you have to do something about it. You have to investigate it. You have to act on it. And I look at that kind of a scenario and think, my goodness, if you didn't and something happened, where would you be? Where would the liability be? It would really be extraordinary. Because you and I have talked about what's happened in Columbine in the past, and we know that there's a tremendous amount of class action litigation going on today because there was information that those kids that did the killing in Columbine, there was information prior to that or evidence that they just might carry something out. So you just never know, and that's the scary kind of thing when you don't know, and there already is a template where kids who are disturbed, who have been victimized, have been bullied. That's a pretty volatile cocktail here. When you've got somebody like that who, maybe for legitimate reasons, in high probability for legitimate reasons, is just very angry, Rhonda. You know, they've been bullied, they've been marginalized, and here they are, angry. It's like a cry for help in many ways, but you just don't know.
Stuart, if your child were, let's say, sharing grade 11 with this student, what would you want to see done?
Well, when you personalize it like that, if it's my child, I want to get to the bottom of this. I want my child to be safe. I want to be ensured that my child can go to school, can be in that classroom, and there is no threat. And that threat has been thoroughly, and I mean thoroughly, looked after, gotten to the bottom of it. And for all I know, and we don't know what that is. We don't know all the sort of circumstances that have gone on here. What we do know, though, is that the police have kept that boy for quite a long period of time, an extraordinary period of time, really, and set a fairly significant bail. So when you look at that, you're saying to yourself, wait a minute now, what's going on here? What's gone on? And what has constituted that kind of police action? That would worry me. And that would bother me a lot until this is finally looked after. And so as a parent, I'd be very concerned. I'd want to make sure that, that not only my child was safe in that class setting, but the entire school was safe. And that before any sort of finalizing of the incident occurred, that had been demonstrated.
Do you know, taking a creative writing assignment like this and writing a story about blowing up the school at exactly 12:12. I think that would be frightening enough just on its own if you were to roll back the clock just a few years. But in our modern day context, in light of Columbine, what sort of wisdom does it show? Now, admittedly, this kid is just 16 years old, but what sort of wisdom was at play to write such a thing? Like, you had to know that it would be frightening or that people might take it seriously.
I think the high probability is he probably did. That when you write something like that, you're writing from past knowledge, most probably fictionalized as it is, you're writing from something you know about. So if you're doing that, you're doing it for maximum impact. You want that story of yours to be heard. And you want that story, when it's heard, to have as strong a kind of a momentum that it can have. And so, yeah, I would think that that would be in the boys' intentions. And the same token, you know, it would also be like a cry for help. Because when you think about revealing yourself like that, you know, you're traumatized, perhaps. You certainly are on the outside looking in. You certainly don't feel welcome. You certainly feel like you've been bullied. And these are really very, very severe, strong feelings. Now, to reveal that in front of the world, in a teenager's world is his school. It's his classroom. That's his intimate world. So you're telling, as a person, it's like coming out of the closet where you're saying, this is me, I hurt. And this is what I'm going to do back. Maybe. It's a fiction, but everybody in that classroom probably knows the history here. They probably know that this kid has not been one of the group, maybe. And so, yeah, a cry for help, one of quite frankly, of utmost concern, both to a bystander and certainly to the officials in charge of that building.
Is there any way to predict potential violence among our teens, to predict potential violence in our schools?
Well, you know, Rhonda, there are various indicators that we know that are there. And we know, for example, that if a child has changed behaviors, if in fact they've changed friends, they're wearing different kind of clothing, they don't want to go to school, their grades have dropped, that's not saying that there's going to be violence there, but that's saying that we have somebody here whose behavior has changed enough that we have to take a closer look. The parents would see that, the teachers would see that. They'd see certain unhappiness where they maybe hadn't seen it before. Grades fall off in school, homework's not being done, isolation is sort of demonstrated. So when parents see that, or when teachers see that, then you know that there's something maybe needs to be addressed here. And of course, we've talked about this before too, but when you go back into the long sort of litany of these things occurring over time, in elementary school at a very early age, you know, kids that have been bullied, kids that have been victimized, have very long school records, you know, dossiers of incidents that have been occurring over time. And so you know that when a child has been burdened, and I use that term for a reason, burdened with this kind of affliction, really, that there will be a building anger. So there's a potential there. You don't know that it's going to carry out, but it's a potential that I think society today, ever since the Columbines and the Tabors and so on, there's a recognition there today that these kinds of kids, we need to take a hard look here. And there's also an understanding, and maybe not as well understood as it could be, but you know, in any given school today, anywhere in Canada, for that matter, North America, there is a percentage of kids that are mentally disturbed.
That's frightening. That
need assistance. That's just in the general statistics, in the population. And what we do know, that if those kids aren't being looked after, if there aren't programs where referrals have taken place, that they are now in the general population of the school. So, if we know that there aren't programs out there, we know that kids who aren't in those programs are going to be in the general population. And they need assistance. And so that's, again, another group where there can be a potential tragedy coming out of.
Okay, I want to talk to you more about that, but first we have to take a commercial break. Also, our phones are ringing. A couple phone lines open right now. The number to call is 905-332-3131 or 416-203-0302. We're back with more right after these messages. Welcome back to Rhonda London Live. Today we're talking about a case that has made headlines. A 16-year-old from the Cornwall area has been charged with uttering death threats because of a drama assignment that he handed in. It was entitled Twisted, and the main character of the storyline threatened to blow up his school at exactly 12:12. Those are the facts that we know. And of course, because of the Young Offenders Act, there's a lot of things that we can't, a lot of things that we won't know until this wends its way through the courts. But Stewart, we do know that a 16-year-old has submitted an essay, and that he was arrested after it. And, where do you draw the line? I know that you say you want to err on the side of caution, and if your child was attending that school, you'd want to make sure that everything was done to make sure, like, to get to the bottom of the story, whether it was a threat or whether it was simply a work of fiction. But where do you blur the line between fact and fiction, and can you put imagination on trial?
Well, I mean, you've got to sort it out. I go right back to that. It's judgment. You make a judgment. And again, both of us don't know the detail of this because it's the Young Offender Act, privacy information. But it's a scary thing, and it scares me. It'd scare me if I was a teacher in that school, or a principal running the place. And I know that it's a blurry kind of line about where you draw it and how you sort it out. But you simply have to enter that gray area. You've got to get there, and you've got to get to the bottom of it. And if you don't, the liability, and we've mentioned this, it's really quite extraordinary. I mean, can you imagine if you didn't? And then the kid acted?
I can see the news stories then, and we would be covering the story with a very different angle.
Holy smokes! This would be one major lawsuit. Just everybody would be handed a piece of paper here. And so, to look at that from that context alone, the school board really doesn't have a choice. They have to sort it out. They have to find out what the problem is. And as far as the police are concerned and what kind of charges are laid, something that as they say, I can't really comment on because I don't know the detail, and I don't think anybody knows the detail. We can make assumptions that it's gone too far and so on. We simply don't know, and that's the concern.
Well, our phone's very busy today. Let's go to Megan on line 7. Go ahead, Megan. You're on the air.
Hi.
Hi. Go ahead. You're on the air.
Yes, I'm from the Cornwall area, and I'm just watching the show now, and I've been following this as closely as possible with the Young Offenders Act and all the publication bans that are in place now.
Right.
But the real issue is not the presentation this 16-year-old had in his school. It was not the drama class why he was arrested. It did have a part to play in it, but it was the actual threats that he made against actual students and staff. The way that everybody's reacting to this, like the lawyer from Toronto, the prominent lawyer who is
Clayton Ruby,
representing the 16-year-old for free, the writers' associations that are making such a big deal out of a freedom of speech, when in fact it's not the freedom of speech that's an issue here, it's the safety of the children in the school and the actual threats that were made.
Okay, Megan, you bring up some excellent points, and I'm sure that Steward Auty would side with Megan.
Well,
it's frightening when your child goes to a school where there's a situation like this.
Sure, and I agree that on the one hand, the safety is important, but there's another side to it too, and that is the fact that the child's been bullied, the child's been victimized, and that's an issue in itself.
Isn't it ironic, too, that the 16-year-old who has been taunted and teased and tormented and even viciously beaten up one day during a sports game, he's the one who spent more than 30 days behind bars, but his bulliers, they're free and clear, and they're not suspended. He's actually suspended from school.
Well, I hate to say this, but that's life. That's what happens, and one of the previous responsibilities that I had was in the Vanier School for Young Offenders, and when I administered that program, which is a school and a jail, virtually every one of those kids in that school who were behind bars had been victimized, had been bullied. I mean, kids that go through this history of being abused often will end up being the abusers, and they will end up fighting back in their own fashion. And that's the terrible consequence of not acting early and stopping this kind of behavior before the victim becomes the victimizer.
Let's go to Michael on line 1. Go ahead, Michael. You're on the air.
Just the thing that I see happening here is, the fact is that with all the recent events that have happened, for example, Columbine and such, that maybe it was all just taken too quickly. Did none of the teachers actually ask him what was going on? And did they, actually ask him if it was fiction or real in the first place? I think by the sounds of it, because I'm not from that area, is that they took this assignment, they looked at it, and then they automatically went to the police. For some reason, I don't think sounds like he was given a fair chance to even explain what was going on.
Well, Michael, thank you for your phone call. My understanding is that it went to the principal first, and then the police became involved. And the principal of the school said, that she's sorry that there's been this overreaction, but what choice did she have? Would it help things, Stewart, if there was like that intermediary step like there used to be in the quote-unquote good old days when you would have counselors on staff at school?
Well, I mean, to have counselors obviously is a good thing and under any circumstances. And I think what changes the picture today is that there is now a history. The Columbines form a history, and they provide a template of what can happen. And I think that's the difference. There's always been, I used to be in a school, a high school setting, and we'd have our threats, our bomb threats on a sunny Friday afternoon, or when exams were on. You remember those days, Rhonda?
Yes, I sure do.
Sure. And hopefully, you'd be out into the sun and take the afternoon off or whatever, but it never happened.
No.
And so when you got those kinds of threats, you really didn't have the same kind of reaction that legitimately school officials have today. So that separates yesterday from today. And so parents have every reason to show concern and to be concerned, and school officials have every reason, both legally and personally, to react a little bit differently with a little more concern than maybe they would have in the past.
And I'm a little bit concerned too about the wisdom of a student, a 16-year-old, writing a story dealing with this kind of subject matter, just in light of all that's happened. Even if it is a complete work of fiction, it's a little bit frightening to me.
Well,
it's more than a little bit frightening.
Hey, you're right. And what we do know in this case, at the very least, what we know is that this child needs some counseling here. We need to talk about why this is being written about and the way it's being written and so on, even if it is fiction, which hopefully it is. But we certainly know that there are other ways to express yourself more appropriately, more to try and maybe sort your own behaviors out. And I think that what this is demonstrating, and I said a little bit earlier, was to me a cry for help. Where when you write that kind of thing and you're exposing yourself and you're exposing your emotions to your classmates who form your world, that's pretty significant.
Okay. Let's go to Ian on line 2. Go ahead, Ian. You're on the air.
Hello.
Hi, Ian. Go ahead. You're on the air.
Hi. I'm sorry. I am just appalled at the reaction to this. This is incredible. If J.R.R. Tolkien were the subject of this, would he be locked up on the grounds that he lives in a psychotic fantasy world of intimate detail?
Yeah, you bring up an excellent point, and this is something that has really troubled me about this story, Stewart, is the fact that, Hollywood can create the Basketball Diaries where the storyline involves, the disenfranchised youth going into the school and picking on jocks, very much the template for what actually happened at Colorado. Hollywood can present a movie like that and we'll spend $12 to go see it. But yet, here's this little 16-year-old, writing in the genre of Stephen King, who is his literary hero, and he ends up in jail for more than 30 days.
Well, guess what? What's happening today because of Columbine is that the people that made Basketball Diaries are being sued. That's what's happening. And as a matter of fact, governments now, or society now, is looking at litigation as part of the solution. where when these kinds of products are produced, that a recompense is the tobacco industry. Class action lawsuits now. It's legal to sell cigarettes and tobacco, and so the people that are dying now and are represented by class action lawsuits, and somehow that's supposed to fix the problem. It goes so far that now people will be suing. Well, that's in fact what happened with Basketball Diaries and those kinds of freedoms that are out there that will produce templates for tragedy. And I think that's a very, very significant kind of freedom that maybe needs to be looked at.
Okay, Steward Auty, our time is gone, but I want to thank you so much for joining us today on the show.
My pleasure, Rhonda.
Don't go away. We're going to continue this conversation. When we come back, a legal perspective on the story. The number to call is 905-332-3131. We're back with more right after this. Welcome back to Rhonda London Live. Today we're talking about a case that has made headlines. A 16-year-old from the Cornwall area has been arrested, spent more than 30 days in jail after he wrote a fantasy revenge monologue for his drama class. With his thoughts on all of this, we're joined by Paul McKeever. He's a lawyer who specializes in civil litigation. He's also a spokesperson and an executive member of the Freedom Party of Ontario. Paul, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Rhonda.
Your thoughts, as someone who champions the cause of personal freedoms and freedom of expression, your thoughts on this case?
Well, we don't have enough evidence, obviously, to determine whether or not this person used the material in a threatening way, and I think that's really the key here. It's not so much what the child wrote, but whether it was used to instill fear, in other words, as a threat of violence. If this child had written a story, this exact same story, and told it to a group of high school students in Alberta where none of them knew who he was or that he'd actually experienced any kind of beatings, I think we would be dealing strictly with a Stephen King type story, and I think that child should be absolutely free to write and to tell that story, even if it is scary, because it's not personal.
Right.
It's not instilling fear. It's not meant to instill a feeling of, I'm out to get you. Similarly, if this child had read somebody else's story to his own class in the Cornwall area, but said it with a gleam in his eye, looking at the 11 guys who beat him, or allegedly beat him, and the story were about, how this child was going to blow up the school, I think then, again, it's all on the facts. You'd have to determine whether or not the reason for the communication was to threaten violence. And that's really the issue. The issue is not content, to my mind. A person should be able to write and express whatever words they wish to, provided that they're not threatening the use of coercive force.
But you can cross that line between freedom of expression and a threat. An
Absolutely.
Threat.
I mean, the most clear threats are, I'm going to stab you with this knife, or I'm going to stab you with this knife unless you give me your money.
Right.
But to say that there was once a man who used a knife, or that there was a man who was going to kill Liberty Valance, or whatever it is, these are legitimate things to be able to write about. Whether you're talking sex, violence, whatever may be the taboo, I think that if you're going to have a free society, you have to have no limit on the words that are communicated, provided that they are not communicated for the purpose of threatening the use of coercive.
Okay, our phones are absolutely jammed today. Let's go to Adam on line 3. Go ahead, Adam. You're on the air.
Hi.
Hi.
I work with youth, and I think you can predict whether or not there's going to be violence. If the youth has someone they can talk to, in the majority of cases, violence isn't committed, they have someone they can go to and they trust.
Right.
But also, you have to understand that even if this kind of thing were the threat, it's not something that should be dealt with in a criminal fashion. It should be something that's dealt with, okay, so you're being, you feel like you're abused. Let's deal with that issue, and let's not put them in jail, because that's not going to help things.
Okay, Adam, I want to thank you so much for your phone call. However, I could just see, as I spoke to Steward Auty about, I could just envision covering this story, let's say 6 months from now. And let's get away from Cornwall, because I mean,
Sure.
this is an ongoing case. Let's say it's a school in Ontario where a 16-year-old or a 15-year-old read a story that, you know, a revenge fantasy monologue to a school. And let's say 6 months later, he or she actually goes and carries out those threats and actually blows up the school, and there's a loss of life. I could envision, as a journalist covering the story then, saying, you know, well, 6 months ago, this kid read this story. Like, what has to happen before somebody intervenes and somebody does something? So it's a very slippery slope. It's a very difficult balancing act.
Well, I think there's a difference, though. On the one hand, we're concerned about the freedom of the child to express himself, and on the other, we're talking about the responsibilities of the de facto parents, or the de jure, I forget what the in loco parentis, I think is the legal term, but the parents are effectively the teachers at school, and the teachers and the education system, while the children are on, you know, school property, I believe have a duty to protect them, just as the police would have a duty to protect them on the street. There is a failure, I think, that you know, in the Cornwall case, if the child was in fact beaten while on school property, I think that's something that has to be considered. The school system has let him down and his parents down. And
the school system has let hundreds, thousands of kids just like him down every day.
Yes, and I know many of them personally, and I'm sure everybody does. Now, that's not to say that schools can be perfect, but it is to say that when a child writes a story like that, I think it's incumbent upon the school to do probably much what it did in this instance, and that is to show some concern, to investigate, and to determine why this child might be writing. If it's just an innocent Stephen King thing, then fine. If the child has been beaten, I think they've got a duty to get to the root of it, and as your first guest was saying, help the child through it. Now, that's not to say, as this last caller said, though, that we should ignore or simply never call the police. If there is a death threat, if there is a threat of violence, I don't think we can simply say, well, but that person's had a hard time. As Stewart said, it's often the victims who become the victimizers, and I think we cannot afford to draw the line based on sympathy for a person's past experience.
Okay, let's go to Carol on line 7. Go ahead, Carol. You're on the air.
Yes, hi.
Hi, Carol. Go ahead.
Hello. Hello.
Hi, go ahead, Carol. You're on the air.
Sorry.
No problem.
I was saying how, you know, right now the government has been trying to take control out of the parents' hands as far as you know, spanking their children, disciplining their children, so on and so forth. And I mean, to me, it begins at home. Like, regardless if we can predict the school violence or not, who has control over these children if the government is insisting that we should not discipline our children? How do we, like you said, it's a fine line, but again, how do we deal with that fine line, especially if, like I said, it's the roots come from home. It's your parents. Your parents guide you, and yes, they're in school for about 6 hours out of the day. And it's also the teachers as well that have to get involved. But as you know, the system is very stressed right now. Right. Teachers are on strike, and you know what I mean? So where do we turn to as parents?
Yeah, Carol, you bring up an excellent point. And how do we even protect our kids? You know, if our kids are being bullied and pushed around and even beaten up at school, you know, there seems to be very little that parents can do.
Well, surely, I mean, a lot of people these days are at work while their children are at school, and I think they are required to, by the circumstance, but also have a right to, rely upon the people taking care of their children during those times, rely upon them to make sure that the children aren't injured, at the very least. At
the very least, and not threatened and intimidated.
There's, to my mind, very little difference between threatening violence and doing violence.
That's all, yeah, exactly. We have to take a commercial break, but don't go away. We'll be back with more Rhonda London Live. Phone line's absolutely jammed right now. When we come back, we'll take more of your calls to hear your thoughts on this case. We're back right after these messages. Welcome back to Rhonda London Live. Paul McKeever, phone line's very busy today. Let's go to Joan on line 5. Go ahead, Joan, you're on the air.
Yes.
Hi, Joan.
Hi. The fact that that boy was in a creative writing class and you're instructed to to write about something you can relate to.
Right.
Maybe he didn't have the savvy to not use the real names, and that could have been a big problem. But you have to look at all these things, because he has to write about something he can relate to be able to have a good creative writing story.
Yeah, Joan, you bring up an excellent point, and that is so true. You know, the number one rule in creative writing class is write what you know.
Right. Well, I think that I think she brings up.
But that's also what makes this so terrifying.
Well, this is right, and maybe she's right, and we don't know about this particular child's case. It could be that he just made an unfortunate choice of words and unintentionally wrote some of the things he wrote. But again, it's not what he wrote, it's why he communicated the message. To say, you know, I'm going to kill you, if it's understood in the circumstances that you're just blowing off steam or you're just telling even a joke, is one thing. On the other hand, if the circumstances are such that the line, I'm going to kill you, means I'm going to kill you, that's a different thing altogether. And there's no easy way to say, oh, it's always this way or it's always that way. And all of the circumstances have to be looked at by a trier of fact, be it a judge or a jury, to decide whether this child simply was loose with his pen and maybe could have worded things a little better, or whether he was, in fact, trying to threaten people.
So you're saying that it's not so much what he wrote, and this will be up to the courts to decide what his specific intent was.
That's right. I'm saying he could have said the exact same things to a crowd whom he did not intend to threaten, presumably, with this speech or with this play. And I couldn't see for the life of me that he should be in any way charged for something like that. If, on the other hand, he uses it as a vehicle to threaten someone, and he does intend to threaten them with bodily harm, then I think you're looking at possibly a criminal situation.
Indeed. Let's go to Julie on line 7. Go ahead, Julie. You're on the air.
Hi.
Hi, Julie. Go ahead.
Actually, what I was going to say is that I feel that the victim in this whole thing is actually the boy himself, because you know, he's been bullied at school, he's been threatened, and now he spends 30 days in jail. And, you know, did he ever get any counseling from the school? Could he turn to somebody? It's just like he's been victimized twice. First by the school, because I don't think the school is really doing anything about this. And then again, you know, going to jail and facing all these charges. And then coming out, and I'm sure, again, you know, this is going to be something that the bullies are going to be picking at him for going to jail again.
Well, he's actually suspended from school, and my understanding is that it's a lifetime, that he's absolutely thrown out of school. And Julie, he spent his birthday, his 16th birthday, behind bars. He spent Christmas and New Year's behind bars. He's been released now on $10,000 bail. This is pretty hefty. Yeah. Punishment, even thus far, and this is before it has even seen the light of a courtroom.
Yeah, and I think, to be fair to the child, I think the thing should be tried before they make such serious decisions as to, if it's true, to keep him out of the school ad infinitum or any other sort of punishment. Although he does have to be processed in the same way as any other person of the same age would be processed were they charged with a criminal offense.
But what a cruel irony. And I know you say, like, uttering a threat to you is the same as any kind of actually committing the violence. But it just really seems a cruel irony in all of this. This kid has been tormented, he's been teased, he's been picked on, he's actually been physically assaulted and beaten up. And, you know, he's understandably angry. He writes a story that may have been just a complete work of fiction, or may have been expressing his personal feelings, and he ends up going behind, you know, that he's the one who's behind bars.
Well, you know, the golden rule is the golden rule, and you do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Now, if this child doesn't like that he's been threatened or that he's been beaten, he should not be doing the same to others. And it's unfortunate that he's been allegedly picked upon. Well, that's fine. Let's go after the people who picked on him. Let's go after the people who allegedly beat him, as well as this child, if he in fact has intentionally tried to use this story to threaten people.
Intimidate. Let's go to Sandra on line 2. Go ahead, Sandra. You're on the air.
Hi.
Hi, Sandra.
Hi. I've just moved over here from England. I'm Canadian born, but I moved to England for 15 years. I have a daughter that was in the British school system. In England, they encourage talking about bullying. They have signs all over the school that you can talk to a teacher. I was a serving police officer, and we used to go to the schools and talk about bullying. And what I can remember, we don't have the same scenario that you people have over here. Well, you people, Canadians. It's talked about. It's openly discussed. It is dealt with as a real problem. And you know, what I find here is people don't want to talk about it. They sweep it under the carpet. The school system doesn't want to deal with it in a way that I think they should. And I think it would prevent an awful lot of things that are happening in Canada and the United States.
Yeah, Sandra, thank you so much for your phone call. And I think just about everyone has some story of either from grade school or from high school, some story of intimidation or bullying. And what's sad to me is if you talk to kids who are within the school system right now, you hear the same stories that you heard when I was in the school system or when you were in the school system or when the generation before was in the school system. It doesn't seem like we're making much progress in terms of dealing with bullying.
Well, I mean, it may be that there's not much progress that can be made. Some mountains are immovable, and some children, characteristics of children will always be characteristics of children. But we have to nonetheless try to do our best and to respond when a child expresses some kind of fear or report that he's been abused. And perhaps we should be encouraging to report more often. It's interesting, though, that people in this particular situation, the arts movement and various civil liberties lawyers, et cetera, have been very quick to see this as a threat to freedom of expression. And it may well have been. If the police have acted simply on the content of the story or the fact that it was written, surely that is improper and is a threat to freedom of speech. The real question is whether it was communicated for the purpose of you know, as I say, threatening harm. It's very, I have to read this to you because it's, Thomas Paine was actually a political activist, as you may know, and was defended by a lawyer when he was, for writing The Rights of Man, tried. And in the course of making submissions to the jury, his lawyer quoted one Lord Chatham as saying, "Be to their faults a little blind. Be to their virtues very kind. Let all their thoughts be unconfined, nor clap your padlock on the mind." And I think that's fair to say in this child's case as well, in terms of what he may have written.
Okay.
I think he's free to write it. He's just not free to threaten people with it.
Paul McKeever, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Don't go away. We're going to continue this conversation. Phone line's very, very busy today. The number to call is 416-203-0302. We're back with more right after these messages. Welcome back to Rhonda London Live. Joining our conversation, Dr. Rose Dyson. She's the chair of Canadians Concerned About Violence and Entertainment and is also the author of Mind Abuse, Media Violence in an Information Age. Rose, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me, Rhonda.
Your thoughts on this case? How seriously should we take the case of this 16-year-old boy from Cornwall who's been charged, spent more than 30 days in jail for he's been charged with uttering death threats, and most of it stems from a disturbing essay that he wrote.
I think we should take it very seriously. It is the tip of the iceberg of a growing problem in schools. Bullying, obviously, it's already been discussed by your previous guest, was one of the causal factors in all of this. And we have templates of other kinds of tragedies that have occurred. In this case, it was nipped in the bud, but the potential for it to have evolved into something much more serious was there. Now, should have the youngster been put in detention for a whole month? That does sound rather extreme. But again, we don't know all the other details.
No.
We don't know what his personal history was, apart from writing this story. And the problem here, in my view, there are a number of them, but one of them is that the education system system. More and more is being demanded of it. More and more is being expected of the teachers to deal with. As there are more budget cutbacks, elimination of counseling services, the problem of violence among young people is growing.
And there's no intermediary step.
No.
You can't refer a child like this who may be in trouble, or it might have just been a work of complete fiction. What do you do with them other than refer them to the police?
Well, that's right.
Or do nothing.
And there are too many examples, in my view, of Band-Aid measures to a problem like this. We have, in the last federal election, we certainly heard a great deal of concern expressed about the Young Offenders Act and how it needed to be tightened up and toughened up. And there's some parties that are actually wanting to lower the age that a child can be tried in adult court to 10, which is ludicrous, in my view. Wow. But that's another demonstration of how we're beginning to move in the direction of enshrining in law that the victims are going to be cracked down upon, while the perpetrators, some of the real offenders, in my view, who create and produce and distribute popular cultural commodities that are known from the research to have an exacerbating effect on the behavior, violent behavior of young people. I mean, it's no accident that we're seeing more of these incidents of bullying, and some of them resulting in real tragic circumstances, deaths among young people, because they're now being brought up in a cultural environment that is pretty polluted with violence and horror stories and heroes and role models like Stephen King.
And you call it mind abuse.
Yes, I do.
Our phones are so busy today, Rose, so let's go to Barbara on line 5. Go ahead, Barbara. You're on the air.
Hi,
Hi, Barbara.
I'm calling about my daughter. This was 8 years ago, and I complained to the teachers and principals about her being abused by some of the boys in the schools and threatened by a knife, and they just ignored me. And at the same school, the next year when she graduated and went into college, there were reported 9 gang rapes in that same school.
Wow.
And I think that really these warning signs are there. And it's not getting any better, as we can see guns being taken to school and other things. And I think the warning signs are there. It's just that they have to be taken seriously.
Well, thank you for your call, Barb. You know, it just seems that we are, and I don't think that these are just like anecdotal stories that we're hearing today. This is anecdotal evidence. I think there is a real ineffectualness in dealing with these kinds of incidents in our schools.
I agree.
And kids should feel safe when they're trying to learn.
That's right.
That should be like number one.
Yeah, of course. And this should become a wake-up call for people in a number of different sectors of society. On the one hand, it's laudable, I suppose, that prominent writers like Patrick Watson and others are rushing to this kid's rescue, but it's rather short-sighted and self-serving, in my view, some of the analogies they're drawing. This is a far-fetched comparison to the plight of This Hour Has 7 Days. It's on the CBC in the 60s as an expression of censorship, I suppose, or a violation of the right to freedom of expression. Also, one thing that I think is important for us to bear in mind, and I'm not sure that Paul knows this or expressed it, we do have some limits on freedom of expression. I mean, we can't just say anything we want anytime, anywhere. You can't walk into a crowded theater and yell fire because that might threaten people. We have lawsuits on libel and defamation of character. We've got certain kinds of hate propaganda that are restricted under the criminal code. I am among those that would like to see more restriction to protect women from glorified violence, and we remember the controversy over Eminem when he was here in Toronto and celebrating violence against women in his lyrics. So these are serious cultural, social, and mental health problems, as well as educational problems that all sectors of society have to address. It can't be left only up to the schools and
or the police.
We have to, in the cultural little community start doing something to make the production and distribution of this kind of material that has such a strong socializing effect on young people more difficult. And as you know, Rhonda, because we talked about it before, one of the first things I'd like to do or see done is elimination of tax breaks and incentives for, as well as funding grants through telefilm or provincial film development corporations to fund extremely violent film and television productions. I don't think the most famous, celebrated heroes for young people should be those who write stories like Stephen King.
Good point. We have to take a commercial break, but don't go away. We'll be back with more Rhonda London Live and try to get to more of your calls right after these messages. Welcome back to Rhonda London Live. We're talking to Dr. Rose Dyson, author of Mind Abuse. Phone's very busy today. We've got time for one more quick phone call. Let's go to Diane on line 6. Go ahead, Diane. You're on the air.
Hi, Rhonda.
Hi, Diane.
This issue do hit home with me. I have a 16-year-old who is development delay, and you do have a lot of problems in school. I'm tired of hearing people say the government and the school. It's my child. My son did threaten a teacher, and the school promised they were going to get an officer to speak to him. After 2 days, and they did not, I follow up with it myself. I took him to the police station, and I was very involved. It was not the school's responsibility. I see issues coming up, and I think parents, I work, my husband work, I find time and I be involved. Parents must be more involved.
Diane, thank you so much for your phone call. What a courageous parent. But I would think that Diane might be somewhat in the minority. I don't know very many parents who would take such a courageous and bold step.
True, and be so assertive about it. Again, parents, of course, have more responsibility, but I think teachers do as well. Everybody does.
Dr. Rose Dyson, it's always so nice talking to you. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Always a pleasure to be on your show, Rhonda.
And that is our show for today. Thanks so much for watching. I'll be back here again on Monday. I hope you'll join me. In the meantime, have a great afternoon and a wonderful weekend. We'll see you again on Monday.
You're watching CTS, family-friendly television.